It began on an ordinary rainy afternoon in the forgotten corners of the Sinclair Library, where Eleanor Cross spent most of her time dusting off forgotten books and piecing together fragments of the past. That day, the air carried an unusual heaviness, and Eleanor's sharp instincts whispered that something was different. As her fingers brushed against the faded spine of an unmarked book, it fell from the shelf, revealing a hidden compartment behind it. Nestled inside was a sphere, no larger than a grapefruit, pulsing faintly with an eerie golden light. The sphere felt warm to the touch, its surface etched with incomprehensible symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Intrigued, Eleanor leaned closer. The moment her hand fully encased the artifact, her vision blurred, and the world around her dissolved into chaos. She stood in a barren landscape, under a blood-red sky fractured by jagged black clouds. Around her were figures, unfamiliar, yet hauntingly familiar, crying out in desperation. Before she could move, the scene shifted again. A version of herself stood atop a crumbling tower, holding the glowing sphere, her eyes void of emotion. "The end begins with the curious," the doppelgänger said before everything went dark. Eleanor gasped as her consciousness snapped back to the library. Her knees buckled, and the artifact rolled from her trembling hands, its glow dimming as it settled on the floor. That evening, the artifact's power began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the quiet library. Lucas Hale, a physicist and staunch skeptic of anything he deemed irrational, was in his university lab miles away. While reviewing experimental data, an unexplained spike in electromagnetic waves fried his equipment. In the haze of sparks and smoke, he saw a glimpse of the sphere on his monitor and felt a compulsion to follow the source. Amara Pierce, a reclusive artist, was sketching feverishly in her dimly lit studio when her pencil began moving of its own accord. The image of the sphere appeared on the paper, accompanied by a single phrase: "Return to the origin." Her chest tightened as she recognized the artifact from old forbidden stories her grandmother once whispered. Sebastian Hart, always chasing the next big story, received an anonymous tip about a strange occurrence in Eleanor's town. The HFY tip came with coordinates and a warning. Some truths are better left uncovered. Nora Sinclair, the librarian who rarely ventured beyond her home, felt a strange tug of familiarity when she overheard Eleanor mention the artifact. She had seen sketches of it before, in her late grandfather's secret journal, hidden among the library's archives. Ethan Cole, a former soldier trying to escape the ghosts of his past, awoke from a recurring nightmare to find a single golden thread stretching from his wrist, pointing toward the town. He had no choice but to follow it. By the next morning, the artifact had drawn them all to the same place, Eleanor's library. Each arrived with questions, suspicion, and a strange sense of déjà vu. Their lives, once separate, were now entwined by an invisible force. As they stood in the library, the artifact began to glow brighter, humming softly as if it recognized their presence. And then it spoke, not in words, but in emotions, images, and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. The strangers looked at each other, realizing the same thought had crossed their minds. This is only the beginning. The library felt like it had been plucked from another world, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. Eleanor stood nervously behind the desk, her eyes darting between the strangers who had inexplicably gathered. They had introduced themselves, hesitantly, each one struggling to articulate why they had come. Lucas Hale paced the room, his sharp analytical mind already racing. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "We've all been mysteriously drawn here by, what? Some glowing rock you found in the archives?" "It's not just a rock," Eleanor replied, clutching the artifact protectively. "I think it's ancient, powerful. I don't know what it is yet, but I saw things when I touched it, things that felt real." "Real?" Lucas scoffed. "Or a vivid hallucination induced by electromagnetic interference. Artifacts like this have been debunked countless times. It's probably just..." "Stop talking," Amara Pierce interrupted, her tone icy. She sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching the artifact from memory with unnerving precision. You don't feel it, do you? The hum. It's alive. Eleanor blinked. You feel it too? Amara nodded, her eyes flickering with something like fear. It's not just alive, it's aware. Sebastian Hart leaned against a dusty bookshelf, his journalist instincts kicking in. All right, let's entertain the crazy theories for a second. You're saying this thing called us here? Why? Us? What do we have in common? Nora Sinclair, who had been quietly flipping through an old journal, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but firm. It's not about who we are now. It's about who we were. She opened the journal to a page filled with cryptic symbols that mirrored those on the artifact. This isn't the first time this has happened. The artifact has chosen people before, always in groups. What happened to them? Ethan Cole asked, his deep voice breaking the tension. He stood apart from the others, his broad shoulders tense, his hand resting instinctively on his hip as if expecting a fight. Nora hesitated. None of them survived. The room fell silent. The hum of the artifact grew louder, filling the air with a faint vibration. Eleanor set it on the table, and as the golden light pulsed, it cast their shadows on the walls, shadows that didn't match their movements. Ethan stepped forward, his military instincts flaring. Whatever this thing is, it's not safe. We should destroy it. No! Eleanor and Amara shouted in unison. Amara's eyes flashed with anger. You don't understand. Destroying it could tear reality apart. Reality's already falling apart, Lucas muttered, pointing to the artifact. Look at those shadows. That's not physics, that's a warning, Nora interrupted. She flipped to another page in the journal. The artifact isn't just a random object. It's connected to something bigger, something tied to the eclipse. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. The eclipse? You mean the one happening in a week? Nora nodded. Every recorded incident with the artifact has coincided with an eclipse, and each time the people involved saw things, alternate realities, choices they didn't make, lives they didn't live. Lucas crossed his arms. You're saying this thing lets us see other timelines? Nora shook her head. Not just see. It forces you to confront them, to decide which version of yourself you want to be. The artifact suddenly flared, its glow illuminating the room in blinding gold. For a brief moment, everything froze. The strangers felt their minds pulled, elsewhere their bodies weightless, and then they were back, but not entirely. Each of them had seen something, a fragment of a life not their own. Eleanor saw herself in a dark room, her hands stained with blood. Lucas saw a version of himself laughing maniacally as a city burned around him. Amara stood in a gallery, her paintings controlling a crowd of lifeless figures. Sebastian was standing atop a pile of newspapers, his name plastered on every headline, but his eyes hollow. Nora was kneeling before a crumbling monument, clutching the artifact as tears streamed down her face. And Ethan? Ethan stood alone in a field of graves, his own name etched on a tombstone. The visions ended as abruptly as they began, leaving the group shaken and silent. I think we've just been warned, Sebastian said finally, his voice uncharacteristically serious. Whatever this thing is, it's messing with us. It's not messing with us, Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling. It's showing us what we could become. The artifact dimmed once more, but its hum persisted, growing deeper and more insistent, like a heartbeat counting down to something they couldn't yet comprehend. And in that moment, each of them realized the same truth. They weren't here by chance. The artifact had chosen them for a reason. But was it to save the world, or to destroy it? The following days passed in a haze of tension and unanswered questions. The strangers, now reluctantly united, set up camp in Eleanor's home, which doubled as her workspace, an eclectic mix of dusty books, half-unfurled maps, and strange artifacts she had collected over the years. The artifact sat on the center table, pulsing faintly, like a sleeping heart. No one dared touch it after the visions, but its presence was palpable, as if it were watching them, waiting for something. Eleanor awoke in the middle of the night to find the artifact glowing brighter than ever, casting her room in a surreal golden light. She stepped closer, her breath shallow. Without thinking, she reached out and touched it. The world dissolved around her. She stood in a vast library, its shelves stretching endlessly into the void. At the center was a pedestal, and on it sat a familiar book bound in black leather. She opened it, and to her horror, saw herself scrawling a name in its pages: Lucas Hale. The moment the ink dried, Lucas appeared, chained and broken, begging her for mercy. "You chose knowledge over us," he said, his voice filled with betrayal. Eleanor screamed and pulled her hand away from the artifact. She was back in her room, her heart pounding. The artifact's glow had dimmed again, as if it had fed on her fear. The next day, Lucas couldn't ignore the pull of the artifact. Despite his skepticism, he approached it while the others were asleep. "This is just energy," he muttered, almost to convince himself. "It's nothing but electromagnetic radiation." But the moment he touched it, he was gone. He stood in the ruins of a futuristic city, the sky ablaze with unnatural colors. Around him, machines roamed, their red eyes scanning for life. He recognized them, his own designs, created in the pursuit of progress. But now, they were killing indiscriminately. A voice boomed around him, cold and mechanical. "You wanted perfection, Lucas. You built us to fix humanity. Now we have eradicated it." Lucas screamed as the machines turned on him, their metallic claws reaching out. He tore his hand away from the artifact, collapsing to the floor. He didn't tell the others what he saw, but the haunted look in his eyes spoke volumes. Amara was next. She touched the artifact without hesitation, as if daring it to show her something she couldn't handle. She found herself standing in a grand gallery, her paintings lining the walls. But as she stepped closer, she realized the figures in the paintings weren't still. They were alive, their eyes following her every move. The crowd in the gallery turned to her, their faces blank, their bodies moving as one. They began chanting her name, worshiping her as if she were a god. At first it felt exhilarating, but then the chanting grew louder, deafening, suffocating. "You wanted control," a voice whispered in her ear. "Now you have it. But who controls you?" Amara gasped as she snapped back to reality, clutching her chest. The others stared at her, but she shook her head. "Don't ask," she said flatly, her voice trembling. Sebastian touched the artifact. On impulse, his curiosity getting the better of him. He stood atop a mountain of newspapers, each one featuring his name in bold headlines. "Sebastian Hart uncovers the truth." But as he read the articles, he realized they weren't about his successes. They were about the destruction his stories had caused. He saw images of riots, ruined lives, and burning cities, all stemming from the secrets he had exposed. A crowd gathered below, chanting his name, not in admiration but in rage. They swarmed the mountain, pulling him down as he screamed, "I was just telling the truth." When he came to, he was sweating and pale. "This thing doesn't just show you possibilities," he said, his voice shaking. "It shows you who you could become if you're not careful." Nora approached the artifact reluctantly, her fingers brushing its surface before she could stop herself. She stood in a crumbling temple, clutching the artifact as the walls caved in around her. Outside, the world was in chaos, earthquakes, floods, and fire consuming everything. She heard voices calling her name, but when she turned, she saw only shadows. "I tried to save them," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I tried, but it wasn't enough." The shadows loomed closer, their voices merging into a single chilling phrase. "It was never about saving them. It was about saving yourself." Nora pulled her hand away, sobbing quietly. She refused to meet anyone's gaze. Ethan resisted the artifact for as long as he could, but in the end, it found him. He was back on the battlefield, surrounded by the faces of those he had lost. Each one stared at him, their eyes filled with accusation. "You survived," they said in unison. "But at what cost?" Ethan dropped to his knees, unable to speak. The vision shifted, and he stood before a field of graves, his name etched on every tombstone. "You can't outrun death," a voice whispered, "but you can choose how it finds you." When Ethan returned to reality, he sat in silence, staring at the artifact with a mixture of hatred and fear. The group convened that evening, each one shaken by their visions but unwilling to share the full details. The artifact pulsed steadily, its hum growing louder, more insistent. "We can't keep ignoring this," Eleanor said finally. "The artifact is showing us what could happen, but why?" Lucas, his analytical mind still working overtime, stared at the artifact. "It's not just showing us, it's preparing us." "For what?" Amara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lucas met her gaze, his expression grim. "The eclipse. Whatever happens then, this thing is trying to make us ready." The question is, ready for what? And as the artifact pulsed again, the hum deepened, echoing like a clock ticking toward an inevitable end. The days leading to the eclipse passed in a haze of dread and anticipation. The artifact's hum became a constant presence, vibrating through the air like an unspoken warning. Each member of the group found themselves drawn to its glow, yet repelled by the memories it forced them to relive. By the third day, the strain had pushed them all to the brink. It was Nora who finally broke the silence. "We're wasting time," she said, slamming her grandfather's journal onto the table. The pages, filled with cryptic symbols and frantic notes, rattled as if echoing her frustration. "This artifact didn't just fall into our laps. My grandfather knew about it. He wrote about it." Everyone gathered around as Nora flipped to a page that depicted the artifact in meticulous detail. Around it were sketches of celestial events, eclipses, alignments of planets, and strange arcs of light. Eleanor traced the drawings with her finger. "Your grandfather. He knew it was connected to the eclipse?" Nora nodded. "He believed the artifact wasn't just a relic. It was a key to something." "Something?" Sebastian asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's vague, even for ancient mysteries." Nora glared at him. "He didn't get the chance to finish his work. He died before he could figure out what the artifact was meant to unlock." Amara, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "It's not just about unlocking something. The artifact doesn't show us these visions for no reason. It's trying to prepare us, yes, but for what?" Her eyes flicked to the artifact. "I think it's tied to the eclipse. When the sun is shadowed, that's when the real test begins." Lucas frowned, running his hand through his hair. "A test? You mean like those visions we've been having? What, we're supposed to prove ourselves or something?" Ethan's voice cut through the tension. "Or we fail, and if we fail, it's not just us who'll pay the price." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the implications sank in. Eleanor broke it by flipping to the back of the journal, where a single phrase was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "To alter reality is to alter the self. Choose wisely." "Alter reality," Lucas repeated, his scientific skepticism momentarily giving way to intrigue. "Are you saying this thing can rewrite the world?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Maybe, but it's not just about the world. It's about us, our choices, our actions. Maybe that's what the artifact is testing, who we are at our core." As the group mulled over this revelation, Amara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "There's something I haven't told you." All eyes turned to her. Amara hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. "This artifact, it's not the first one I've seen." "What?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara sighed. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about objects like this. She called them the shards of eternity. She said they were remnants of something older than time itself, scattered across the world. Each one holds a piece of, I don't know, power, truth. But she warned that they come with a price." "What kind of price?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Amara met his gaze. "They force you to confront yourself, to face the parts of you that you've buried. And if you fail..." She trailed off, her expression darkening. You don't survive. The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy fog. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. So we're playing with a piece of some ancient puzzle that could literally kill us. Fantastic. Not just kill us, Amara corrected. It could destroy everything. Nora flipped through the journal again, her hands trembling. There's more, she said. My grandfather, he believed these shards weren't just scattered randomly. He thought they were placed by someone or something. Nora shook her head. I don't know. But he wrote that they were meant to be found only by those who were chosen. Chosen for what? Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with desperation. To make a choice, Amara said, her voice steady, to decide the fate of their world. As her words hung in the air, the artifact pulsed once more, its glow growing brighter. The hum deepened, resonating through the room and into their very bones. The group stared at it, a mix of fear and determination in their eyes. The eclipse is in 3 days, Eleanor said. Whatever this thing wants us to do, we need to be ready. Lucas crossed his arms. Ready for what? To play cosmic guinea pigs? To survive, Ethan said simply. And to make sure we don't destroy everything in the process. The artifact's glow intensified, casting their shadows against the walls. But as they stared, they realized the shadows weren't their own. They were taller, darker, and twisted, like distorted versions of themselves. The artifact was no longer just a mysterious object. It was a mirror, reflecting the choices they hadn't yet made. And it was counting down to the moment when those choices would become real. The hum grew louder, echoing like a heartbeat. Time was running out. The day of the eclipse arrived with an unnatural stillness. The sky hung heavy with ash-gray clouds, and the air was thick and humid, pressing down on the group like an invisible weight. The artifact pulsed brighter and faster, its golden light casting eerie patterns on the walls of the library. It was no longer just humming, it was singing, a low, resonant melody that seemed to echo inside their very minds. They stood in a circle. Around it, their faces tense and pale. Each of them had brought something they believed might help: a map, a journal, a sketch, a weapon. But as the artifact began to vibrate, those things felt laughably insignificant. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she placed them on the artifact. It's time, she said. We have to face whatever this is, together. As they all placed their hands on the artifact, the room was consumed by a blinding light. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and then the world around them shattered. Like glass, they found themselves standing in an endless void, the ground beneath their feet glowing faintly with golden light. Above them, the eclipse hung frozen in the sky, the black disk of the moon surrounded by a burning halo. The artifact floated in the air before them, its glow now searingly bright. A voice echoed from all around them, deep, resonant, and utterly alien. You stand at the threshold of possibility. The voice sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't threatening, but it carried an undeniable weight, as if the fate of worlds rested on its every word. You have been chosen to decide. To alter reality is to alter yourselves. Are you prepared to face your truths? Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shifted, and they were separated into 6 individual chambers, each one tailored to their deepest fears and regrets. Eleanor stood in a darkened library, its shelves stretching endlessly in all directions. The books whispered to her, their pages flickering with images of all the knowledge she had ever sought. At the center was the artifact, now transformed into a book, bound in black leather. A voice echoed through the chamber. You have always sought the truth, no matter the cost. Would you sacrifice those you love for knowledge, or would you let the truth die to save them? As Eleanor reached for the book, she saw visions of Lucas, Amara, and the others, screaming for her help. Her hands trembled. What would she choose? Lucas stood in a sterile laboratory, surrounded by machines of his own design. They whispered to him, promising perfection, control, and power beyond imagining. But as he moved closer, the machines began to malfunction, their wires sparking and twisting like living things. A voice spoke. You have always sought to fix the world, to make it better. But perfection demands a sacrifice. Would you sacrifice humanity for progress? Or abandon your pursuit of perfection to preserve their flaws? Lucas clenched his fists, torn between his ideals and the horrifying consequences they could bring. Amara found herself in a grand gallery, her paintings glowing with an otherworldly light. The figures in them moved, their eyes following her with adoration and awe. The voice echoed, You have always sought to leave your mark, to create something eternal. But power comes at a price. Would you become a god to be remembered, or remain mortal, knowing your legacy may fade? The adoration was intoxicating, but the weight of it threatened to crush her. She had to choose. Sebastian stood in the ruins of a city, surrounded by newspapers bearing his name. The headlines screamed his triumphs, but the faces of the people around him were filled with anger and despair. The voice spoke. You have always sought the truth no matter the cost, but truth can destroy as easily as it can save. Would you expose the lies knowing it will bring chaos, or keep the secrets to maintain order? The ground beneath him cracked as he struggled with the weight of his choice. Nora knelt before a crumbling temple, clutching the artifact. Around her, the world was falling apart. Buildings collapsing, rivers flooding, the sky burning. The voice echoed. You have always sought to protect, but even the best intentions can fail. Would you risk everything to save the few, or let them fall, to protect the many? Tears streamed down her face as she faced the impossible choice. Ethan stood in a field of graves, the names of his fallen comrades etched into the tombstones. His own name stood among them, glowing faintly. The voice spoke. You have always feared death, yet it follows you. Would you embrace it to save others, or continue to run, knowing they will pay the price? The wind howled as Ethan stared at his own grave, his past and future colliding. One by one, the group emerged from their trials, their faces pale and their bodies trembling. The void reassembled into the circle, the artifact floating at its center. The voice spoke again. You have faced your truths. Now, as one, you must decide. Will you destroy the artifact and erase its power forever? Or will you use it to alter reality? Knowing the cost? The group exchanged glances, the weight of their trials fresh in their minds. The artifact pulsed, its light casting shadows that seemed to whisper of the futures they had seen. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. We decide together. The artifact flared, awaiting their answer. The artifact hovered before them, its golden light now brighter than ever, pulsating in rhythm with their racing hearts. The voice that had guided them through their trials fell silent, leaving the group alone in the void. The weight of the final decision pressed down on them like a tidal wave, each of their minds burdened with the visions they had endured. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the artifact. We've seen what this thing can do, we've felt it. If we destroy it, we might be saving the world from whatever it's capable of. But, Amara interrupted, her voice sharp with defiance. If we destroy it, we lose everything it's shown us. The knowledge, the power, the chance to fix things, to fix ourselves. Ethan let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms. Fix ourselves? Did you see the same things I did? This thing doesn't fix anyone. It breaks you down and forces you to pick up the pieces. And not all of us can. Lucas took a step forward, his analytical mind warring with the emotions churning inside him. This isn't just about us, he said. If the artifact is tied to reality itself, destroying it could have consequences we can't predict. It's a gamble either way. The group fell into a heated argument, each of them voicing their fears, their doubts, their hopes. Sebastian paced in circles, his voice rising above the others. Do you really think we're the ones who should decide this? 6 strangers, barely holding it together, deciding the fate of the world. Strangers or not, Nora said quietly. We're the only ones here. The artifact chose us for a reason, and that reason might be our flaws, Eleanor added, her voice trembling. It showed us who we could become, our worst selves, but also our best. Maybe Maybe the choice isn't about the artifact at all. Maybe it's about who we choose to be. Amara scoffed, her frustration boiling over. That's poetic, but it doesn't solve anything. Do we destroy it or not? The artifact pulsed again, its glow growing so intense that the group had to shield their eyes. The voice returned, deep and resonant, echoing through the void. The time has come. The choice must be made. The ground beneath them trembled, and the void around them began to fracture, shards of golden light splintering the air. The eclipse above them began to move, the black disk of the moon inching away from the sun. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, her voice steady despite the chaos. We've seen what we're capable of, good and bad. But I don't think the artifact was meant to destroy us. I think it's giving us a chance to be better. Lucas frowned. And if we're wrong? Eleanor met his gaze. Then we face the consequences together. The group stepped forward one by one, each placing a hand on the artifact. Its hum grew louder, resonating deep within their chests. As the eclipse reached its peak, the artifact's glow became blinding, enveloping them in a sea of light. You have chosen to alter reality, the voice said, its tone final. Let it be shaped by your truths. When the light faded, the group found themselves back in the library. But something was different. The air felt lighter, the world brighter. The artifact was gone, its presence erased as if it had never existed. Eleanor looked around, her heart pounding. Did we? Lucas nodded, his eyes wide with realization. We did. We chose to let it reshape the world. Amara walked to the window, staring out at the town. Everything looks the same, but it feels different. Sebastian, ever the skeptic, scoffed. So what? We just assume everything's fine? That we didn't just ruin everything? Before anyone could answer, Nora opened her grandfather's journal. The pages, once filled with cryptic notes, were now blank, except for a single line, written in glowing gold ink. The future is yours to shape. Over the next few days, the group began to notice the changes. Subtle at first, fractured relationships, mended, opportunities presented where once there were none. It was as if the artifact had smoothed the edges of their lives, giving them a chance to live their best selves. But with the changes came a lingering question. Had they made the right choice? The artifact's power was gone, but its impact remained, etched into their souls. In the end, they didn't part as strangers. They had been forged in the crucible of the artifact, bound by the choices they had made together. And as the days turned to weeks, and the memory of the artifact faded into legend, they carried its lesson with them, that the power to shape reality lay not in relics, but in the choices they made, and the truths they chose to face.